Let us see if we are live, which maybe we are. Looks like we're live. Looks like we are live. Alright, so that was Pilot Priest with Canyons. A really fantastic track, if I do say so myself. Okay, so I have in front of me a little tiny article which is approximately 8 pages long, and I'm going to give sort of an overview of it. It was written in some haste, but it's really good, and I like it. This article is by Tom Kozinski. This is sort of a... so I don't actually want to read it at the moment. So again, I'm only going through sort of the general points because this is his work. This is not my work, but it's interesting and I like it. It's entitled "Up Brushfire: Building the Insurgency to Win the Culture War." An introduction to New Albion, the European Atlantic homeland, and our kindred folk to realize the grand settlement of our peoples. That is one hell of a title, if you ask me. And there's even a photograph of what looks like the Appalachians up in Maine on the cover. It's a really good photograph. Now then, the first page is about how Western civilization is effectively in a collapse situation, and that this article is more or less sort of an overview of concepts. It's not intended to be anything terribly in depth. It's not intended to be like a great treatise in which everything is going to be laid out like an instruction manual for everyone to follow. It's literally just concepts. But yeah, essentially, I like this paragraph in particular. Actually, I'll read 2 paragraphs from the first page. I like these 2 paragraphs. Okay, so here we go. Paragraph 1, and actually paragraph 2 dovetails in directly from paragraph 1. A relentless effort to push such destruction, which is driven due to materialist, ideological, and potentially ethnological means, has been the accomplishment of a rising global elite, whose ambition is to realize permanent hegemony through the destruction of the underclass into lesser men, more easily controlled through dysgenic population strategies, an enormous social welfare program, and through technological inebriation. Their insight, which has proven largely correct, is that men who are comfortable and have their material needs met while being entertained will regress into more primitive states willingly unless their comforts are threatened. The selfish consumerist, disconnected from clan or cause, is the result, and he is loyal to no one but his immediate desire. That's the end of the first paragraph. The second paragraph, again, just dovetails directly, but I'd like to pause for a moment and just note that this is basically the Brave New World model being described. Elaine Sabatino, freaking awesome to see you here. How's it going, buddy? This is an article. This is a very rough draft of an article by Tom Kozinski, and he's running for president in Maine, U.S. president. And, I mean, of course, he doesn't have a snowball's chance in hell, but that's hardly the point. By running for president, that sort of puts you into the realm of, okay, but now I get to just talk about things. So he's doing this more or less as a way of getting talking points out, which I think is great. I think it's fantastic, and I support that. Anyhow, the materialist matrix that we find ourselves in, one where no one is loyal to, or rather, one is loyal to no one but his immediate desire. This is rank hedonism, and this is exactly what we have been led into, and this is what Aldous Huxley talked about in Brave New World. And children are now being completely indoctrinated into this. If you think about the these programs where little kids are being sexualized, again, this was talked about in Brave New World. Aldous Huxley brought this up, and I remember in my 20s reading that and thinking, that is a bridge too far, buddy. There's no way anyone would sign off on that. Here we are, 20 freaking years later, and it's absolutely happening. Anyway, so we'll continue on to the second paragraph. Such a contemptible man, parenthetical, or woman, and parenthetical, is no foundation upon which civilization may endure, although the elites are creating and maintaining such an underclass through their complete dominance of the media, of education, and of the dominant culture. They too will find their servants incapable of protecting them from the inevitable external forces of healthy primitivism, a will to live, which will extinguish this corruption of the West as surely as all other decadent cultures have fallen. This is largely a perennialist view of civilization, and I do agree with it. I do think that is the case. One of the peculiarities of it's difficult to describe this. There used to be a model of reality that was cyclical, that was adopted by most people, and indeed, even Plato talked about how Atlantis was this wonderful and great civilization from times gone by that ended up collapsing and dying. And it was Plato's idea that civilization has collapsed multiple times and it simply rises again. I am in agreement. I do think that this is the case. If one considers the Mayans, the Incans, the Olmecs, and so on, they stumbled upon these great ruins, these incredible buildings that were like almost Egyptian in spirit. I mean, think, freaking pyramids. Are you kidding me? Those 3 doors, the one large and then the 2 smaller side doors. These are seen in Egypt. These are seen in Cambodia, in South America. These are very important structures. I dare say I think that some probably exist in China as well. Anyhow, I think it's the Olmecs, but I don't recall. They have a legend that the pyramids were built by blue-eyed, red-haired people who are now gone and deceased. So what this suggests is that there may have been an ancient culture founded by white people in South America that was built and then wiped away for one reason or another. I can't for a moment believe that the Amerindians of South America suddenly went from having high technology and blue eyes to low technology and brown eyes arbitrarily. I think that something else happened. Anyhow, I think that there is a lot to be said for the concept that there is going to be a free-fall collapse in some sense here in America, and that we have no choice but to ride it out. However that may come to pass, I don't know. However we figure out how to survive it, I don't know. But we must and we will, so I do have full faith in that. Now there's another section to this article entitled "What is the West?" And this section, I think I actually will read this entire section. The next one is a little bit easier, but this one, I kind of like this one conceptually. I don't know that I fully agree with all of it, but I like where it's going. I like the direction that it's pointing. So here we are. This is entitled, or this is a subsection within the larger article, Op Brushfire by Tom Kozinski. So here is the section. What is the West? To reach any objective, we must first develop an operational definition of what we hope to achieve, and the logical starting place is Western civilization. The simplest explanation is this is the civilization created by the European peoples that was in accordance with the deliberate use of reason, the desire to exist in balance with nature, and a sense of self-confidence, parenthetical grace, and parenthetical, about our own ability to positively impact the world. Any resurrection of the civilization will necessarily need to meet these preconditions to grow, and our current crisis is rooted in the deliberate destruction of each of these attributes. The occupation of our civilization can perhaps best be characterized as a psychological, cultural, and spiritual attack, which is why, despite our enormous wealth and theoretical capacity for self-defense, we have proven utterly helpless against these assaults. The psychological attack on truth manifests in this humanist relativism that argues all fantasies can be equally true and indulged, whereby basic reality can be ignored. The cultural attack on nature seems to place our people into hive situations where we are forced to follow systems rather than instincts, and we are forced to live apart from both our nature and the world around us in realms of artifice and technology. The spiritual attack upon grace is an unending and malevolent attack upon our ability to project our values or any sense of self-worth for our people, individually or collectively, into the world, to degrade our ability to effectuate change. There's a minor editing error there. The end of the sentence isn't, but this was, this was kind of like a very quick. Oh, Ash All Day is here. Hey, buddy, what's going down? This was a very quick type, so the impression that I get was that Tom wanted to get his ideas down on paper, and he's more or less massaging them as the timeline moves forward. So I'm very willing to let that go. Anyway, but let's continue. Side note, Tom is actually going to be coming out with a book, apparently. This is my understanding, anyhow. So this may be some, subsection within the book. I don't know. Let's continue. Understanding the attack on these terms makes clear the elements of a reclamation, which are the heart of what is herein referred to as Operation Brushfire. That's bold. So, boldface type. Operation Brushfire. Very important. Where they spread lies, we must unapologetically and universally demand people adhere to the truth. I'm going to break in for just a moment and say, I totally concur with that. I was speaking with a buddy of mine, and he was saying, I was talking about how I'm doing what I can to move into certain types of talking points. This is going to sound kind of weird, but move into certain kinds of talking points so that just straight ahead nationalism will seem perfectly reasonable and logical and whatever, like a default position, basically. And as I was speaking with my buddy, because we're both, this is a buddy of mine that lives here in sunny Los Angeles. Both of us live in basically a, quote, progressive, end quote, stronghold So we're right in the middle of it. And he was saying, I agree with him too, that the vast majority of people, they really just want the feels. They don't want the reals. Most people are not swayed by logic or reason or arguments. As the saying goes, facts don't care about your feelings, and feelings don't care about your facts. Both are actually true. And for this reason, it's like he was saying that he thinks that we should actually adopt the feels position. That is to say, he is also a nationalist. He was saying that he thinks that we ought to basically go for feels nationalism. So protect your people, blah, 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 and appeal to emotion. And I do actually think there is something to that. Raving weirdo autists will be perfectly at home thinking about hyper abstractions and whatever. And the moment you get any of us into a room with regular people, everything deflates and we become absolutely incomprehensible to the average person. And that's not good. That's really not good. So I kind of agree with him. But at the same time, I have personally been a part of this. I have actually gone through hard line measurements of reality, hard statistics, and discussed these concepts. Some of these, and I have to limit myself because you cannot talk about more than one thing in an entire conversation with a regular person here in Los Angeles. I mean, it's difficult enough to just bring up demographics as even a concept if you are white. It's difficult to bring up demographics as even a concept. But by doing such a thing, by bringing up demographics, and by doing so within the context of saying, no, white people are the only ones that overwhelmingly support free speech and the right to keep and bear arms. All other demographics are against those. If you value either one of those, you must be thinking about demographics. And once you start going into the statistics of voting patterns, it's incontrovertible. You cannot ignore it. It's simply the case. And I've had so-called progressives even say, Eke, I hear what you're saying, but, I don't know, man, I'll have to look into it, blah, blah, blah. So, you can pierce through their, I don't know what to call it, but their mental problems, their inability to recognize reality. You can pierce through that just by relying on facts, just by relying on measurable, observable reality. So I'm actually in line, in all honesty, with the concept that truth will be my sword and my shield. So I like very much relying on truth, measurable reality. Yes, there is a valid and good argument for saying that sooner or later you actually from measurable reality, from observable reality, you go into the finer gradations and you start moving into faith in something, and I do understand that. So it depends on what level we're looking at, but in terms of our general experience, in terms of what we are, Robert Anton Wilson's reality tunnels. Our nervous systems are designed to interact in a physical reality that we are capable of observing. So, in general, I tend to think in terms of what we are capable of observing. I am generally not thinking about super abstract theoretical stuff. So I want to go ahead and make that one distinction. So I understand that in some sense I am playing both sides of the field. Anyway, the point is that I absolutely have seen that adhering unapologetically to the truth has actually borne fruits. So I would say to anyone that, if you're going to be talking about these things out in public, as with the Groyper rush, which great big fan of that, by the way. Somebody made a note on Twitter earlier that there are, basically there's a 99% chance that there are phone calls in upper echelons right now about what's going on within the conservative movement, and those phone calls happening right this moment. There are phone calls right this moment in the upper echelons, the elites in government and in think tanks right now are calling each other, and they're using the word Groyper. Think about that for just a minute. Anyhow, the Groyper rush ended up leaning on truth, and just by leaning on truth, they got Charles Israel First Kirk to shut down the Q&A and also to leave early his own meeting, or whatever the hell that thing was, his little conference. So yes, adhering to the truth is absolutely a thing that we should be thinking about. I'm really excited about this. We have a wild Tom in the hangout, so I'm going to prepare myself one moment to chit-chat with Tom. Alright, so we are de-boomer-teching now, and we've got window cap, and I think we're good transitioning over to Tom. Tom, we are streaming now. Can I get a quick hello for a sound check?
Absolutely. Sorry I'm running late.
No, it's okay. It's totally fine. How's it going, man?
It's going well, although I would say you have a tame Tom, not a wild Tom, because I was hoping my wife was something, but
okay.
She sent her regards.
All right. I'll go with it. Well, let's see. Quick recap. I've been reading excerpts from the first 2 pages of your article, Operation Brushfire, so as to give a rough primer. Because it occurred to me that all 24 people here at most, 12 plus a couple of feds, I suppose, may not be totally.
Hey, the feds like the idea on average, so they get it.
Yeah, well, there is. I think it was last year. I think it was FEMA, but I don't remember. There was some kind of a paper that was published. We must secure our borders and build a wall, or something like that. And it was 14 words. There was an official document put out by the U.S. government that actually had specifically 14 words that began with "We must secure." Isn't that funny?
Well, it's totally believable. I will tell you, without casting any aspersions on any individuals and with no specific knowledge that could get anyone in trouble, because we know I don't talk to anyone up here in Maine, I will say this, that there are a number of people within the federal government, especially at the ground level, the lower ranks, who join up with the best of intentions and with knowledge that they're joining up in an effort to try to prevent certain problems from getting worse. So I would say that, as much as these big agencies are politicized in D.C., in the same way that, you don't trust the generals, but you do trust the sergeants, I would say there are a number of very good field agents out there. And, just like it is Veterans Day, right? So we should acknowledge those people who are out there trying to uphold the idea of law and order, as opposed to the people in D.C. who pervert and corrupt it.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, that's kind of almost a segue, because I kind of want to center this on your Operation Brushfire article, I guess, that you sent me.
It's a recruitment brochure, I think, at this point, but a lot of people are enjoying it, and it's not yet we can talk about it, but I haven't put it out publicly because honestly, I just haven't finalized it. But the ideas there were really rooted in this desire to begin thinking of a positive way of what a transition might look like and how we can get there. So Since you've read it, I'll let you lead the questions, but I'll bring it up in front of me here so I remember what the hell I actually wrote.
Yeah, and just to be sure, because I did kind of get the impression that this was not for wider circulation, so I haven't, just so you know, I haven't read the entire thing. Indeed, I read excerpts from the first 2 pages, so just so you know. But
sure. Well, how do you like it? Let's start there.
I liked it. I thought it was great, and there was actually, I guess we can just go point by point.
Yeah, we can talk about. There's nothing. One of the unique things about the New Albion Imperative is that everything we talk about privately, we can talk about publicly. And I put things out in ways where we can talk very intelligently, because ultimately this is a growth model. We want to bring more people in. And if it's something where people are ashamed to be a part of it, that's not something we can ever succeed at, because ultimately we need more high agency people like us in order to be successful.
Yeah. 1 second, I'm just going to do one tiny thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's actually a really, because I've gotten crap from some people about, oh, Eke, you're an optics cuck or whatever, because I intentionally adopt a quasi Mr. Rogers tone on my streams, and I do, like, I get it. I understand the idea that, okay, you know, if you defang yourself too much, then, like, what the hell are we talking about? We may as well be just, you know, showing cat videos or something. And I get that.
Sure, we could hang out with Charlie Kirk and get the big bucks.
Yeah, exactly. But at the same time, I completely concur that if people are ashamed or generally distressed about being a part of something, they will avoid it. They won't be a part of it. And if other people see that, you know, like if let's say that, you know, I joined Project Albion or Operation Brushfire, and I was like furtive and, you know, very coy about it or whatever, and spoke in very low tones and so on, and hid like a siege mask or something, then people would catch on to that and they would be like, I don't know about that, man. That guy's kind of weird. So I don't want to be a part. I don't want to project that. I would much rather project strength and forthrightness. So I completely concur with that.
Well, I mean, one of the things that's really nice in this whole vision that really settles the optics argument is a lot of the optics arguments come down to the question that you're fighting over ancient history, you're fighting over an interpretation of things, or you're fighting over what one group does and the response we have to that group. Operation Brushfire is a different thing. It's a totally transformative mental mindset where instead of talking about how we are going to react or respond to what's happening in this society, we simply make a statement, say that this society does not work for us because we hold certain values, and because of those values, we are going to begin creating our own separate, essentially, nationhood. And in that sense, it's a creative, positive argument where when we talk about things, we're talking about things from a constructive perspective of how we bring things together. And we have a set of core principles. You can read about them in there. It's reason, which is just to say we believe that truth is a thing. Nature, that we want to understand reality how it is. Grace, which is this idea that we forgive ourselves enough to go ahead and start anew and to understand we'll make mistakes. And loyalty, that we will be loyal to one another. And we start from that foundation, and anyone who understands that in the deeper, there's a lot of ramifications of that, but who wants to be a part of that is someone we can work with. I've always said I'm a 90% solution kind of guy, and I understand, you know, all the Naxalt arguments, all the different things. Let people show their own value, and this is a program that's very mindful of both the desire of the West to keep those individual rights and responsibilities, which we believe in, but also recognizing that there are certain collective attributes that are inescapable, and that we need to put them at the center of how we found our society in the future if we hope to survive.
That's actually a neat way of thinking about it, centering on things like mindset, values, and so on. Because that kind of, I mean, not in the negative sense, but it brushes aside a lot of the, because people get so hung up on historical things and these arguments about, you know, we're fighting and who started it and who is in the wrong and blah blah blah. And I kind of feel like we're in a current situation right now where a lot of that, like, I'm really tired of talking about World War II, and I'm really tired of talking about this, that, and the other thing. Like, I get it, and I do think that
it doesn't resonate with people's life because
yeah,
ultimately, let's take the most extreme, hardcore, far right interpretation of World War II. In the end, if you're right, what does it change unless you have a plan to do something about it? And just going out there with the frontal assault of the people who have the most power in society and saying, well, you don't deserve it, give it back. That's like a child whining to their parents that they took their toy away.
yeah,
Ultimately, that's the difference in power. And so what we have to do, and the whole problem with that mindset for me, which I think is really not appealing in general, is that it gives power to certain groups and certain entities and certain institutions and certain individuals over us. And what I am arguing fundamentally is that we need to begin taking that power back for ourselves. This system only works because we give it our consent, and we do that in lots of different ways. So we do that mentally when we invest our energy in debunking their claims. We do it financially when we give money over to them. And so really the New Albion Imperative, which Operation Brushfire lays out, starts to ask this question, saying that if you accept that the American model is broken and cannot be fixed, what do we begin to build as an alternative? And I think it's a question that's a little ahead of its time, but I think about a year from now, a lot of people are going to be asking the questions this document offers. And by talking about it now and organizing it now, I think there's a really great opportunity for us to begin imagining what a new nation would look like. And New Albion specifically has always imagined an Atlantic homeland, an Atlantic culture in the northeast corner of the North American continent where the original European settlers came. And we think it's time for us to reclaim that connection to our history. We believe we have the best demography for it. We have a culture that's well intact. It's something that exists both in America and in Canada, northern New England, the maritime provinces. And we also believe that as America devolves, we've seen white flight move north and east over and over again, given where the population pressures are coming from. We know that people are going to be coming up here looking for new opportunities. Our job is to get in front of that and build a society where we let white families know they're welcome. And I think, when you look at what economic success is or social success or any of these things, the most important thing is your human capital. And we want high agency, high functioning people who want to have families who come from the European traditions that we need to sustain this plan.
yeah. I like it. Yeah, I agree. Also,
I used to be a politician. I guess it shows, right?
No, it's no, it's good. It's good. Okay, so I wanted to, I guess, just go. I should have taken notes. I read it without taking notes, like an idiot. Anyway.
Oh, that's okay. Well, we can talk about anything that's in there, and who knows? Maybe we'll make up some more stuff. I mean, that's one of the things. I mean, I'm working with a group of people. We're growing it all the time, and it's an open source sort of thing. It's what you want to take with it. Now, there'll be a website and all this other stuff. Honestly, I just can't do it because I'm in the rush to get 2 more books out before Christmas because, hey, we all got to pay the bills.
That is true. Well, I will be happy to discuss the new Albion concept now and again. So you'll get at least a little bit of traction with me, even though I'm not the biggest guy in the world, but I can at least talk about it sometimes. So anyway.
Well, that's fine. I mean, it's not about it's about the quality over quantity, and that's one of our big points.
Yeah.
Where they're always trying to do more. We really want to engage people, and the one thing you're never gonna get from me is there's never a question you can't ask.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Rather, this is what I'm understanding. I've only listened to some of the things that you've said and read a couple of things that you've written, but this is the impression that I get as well. Anyhow, all right. So the introduction, that's fine. What is the West? I like the idea, and this is sort of a thing that's popped up several times, which is what defines the West. And there are some people that have this concept that we need to have like hard-line ethno-states where we think only about things like genetic distance and all this good stuff. And in your conception, you basically reject that. And I think that's an interesting decision. There's a guy that I was speaking to months ago. He was saying that it was his opinion that the people that would ironically give themselves over to Christ generally will, and I mean completely, give themselves over, generally will be those with recessive gene traits as opposed to dominant gene traits. And I thought that was because what you end up with is a self-selecting pattern. And with that self-selecting pattern, certain types of people will remain and other types of people will fall away. I thought that was a very interesting... So in a weird way, you're almost, and I stress almost, you're almost coming to the concept of the West as being an idea. So do you have anything you'd like to explain about that? Anything that I'm missing?
Yeah, here's how I put it in the document is that I don't think it's as simple as civic nationalism where you just have, a set of laws and institution or governments you follow. But I don't think the ethno-nationalist version works quite as simply as that, especially in the American context, because frankly, white identity is a bit made up. And I'm not saying that because I lack any sense of white identity. I mean, Lord knows people know I've taken the blows for this. But what I'm saying is that ultimately, white people don't really think of themselves as white. They think of themselves as Polish or Russian or German or English or French. And one of the things that gets fleshed out further in this plan is that I argue that we need to begin developing along ethnic identity and solidarity rather than along this idea of white racialism. And I say this specifically because I think people will be much more inclined to define their heritage when expressed on those terms. And because I think also, like you talked about the importance of recessive populations and how different traits manifest, I spent a lot of time traveling over the country this year, and I had a chance to meet a lot of people in different areas of the United States and Canada, for that matter, who were of different ethnic backgrounds. And I've come to realize an Englishman is not a German. It's just the way it is. Englishmen want to have sort of institutional solutions. There's certain ideas that are culturally favored by different genetic groups, whereas Germans tend to prefer a more direct head-on model to how they deal with problems. And when you look at the way, say, that a person in, let's say, New Hampshire might deal with a problem versus how someone in Wisconsin might deal with it, you start to realize that culture, identity, and genetics are all really connected. And that what ultimately has to unite us has to be some sort of ideas we can agree upon. Otherwise, we could just squabble like the Brothers' Wars that destroyed Western Europe. Highly creative, high potential, but ultimately terribly destructive. And I think so. We're coming to a point in Western civilization where we need to do a couple things. We need to reconcile whose identities are in and whose identities are out and decide on what basis we can agree on this. And I really talk about it in other texts in three terms. There are the things we have to agree that we're going to agree to and we're going to uphold. Like we could say, for instance, marriages between a man and a woman because it's just such a social good. There are things that, we're going to have to agree that we're going to disagree about. For instance, in movement, the Christian pagan thing, which gets talked about ad nauseum, that might be one of those things. And then there are things we're going to have to agree that we're going to reject. I would present Islam as one of them because I see absolutely no virtue to having that in our society in any way, shape, or form. But I say all these things because you mentioned, the importance of an idea, but the ideas themselves are not opaque, but rather they are the cultural manifestation of the desires of the European peoples that we have observed over time. And that the purpose of the project, then, from a cultural perspective in fighting this war, is that rather than saying we're going to try to take political power, we're really going to say we're going to try to learn who we are and what we're about and what our essential truths are as European peoples, and that we are willing to stand on and fight for in an age of relativism and moral decay. And I think that it's good because it's something that it's a little bit open, it's a little bit assimilating, because if there's someone who has a mixed identity, which, let's be honest, a lot of people in America do, that if they are genuinely committed and show themselves committed, then we can work with those people. And I've always said to people, on the ethno-nationalist issue, I mean, if your whole argument is that loyalty to people comes through blood, which is a fine argument to make, how are you going to ask someone to disown a son or a granddaughter or something on the same basis, even closer, by which you want to organize them? So I think that we have to be somewhat realistic in what we can achieve and recognize that within the identity movement, and I would argue within nationalism generally, that our survival is contingent upon building a homeland where we can exist and have hegemony. It is not contingent on having absolute purity. And I would also argue, as a historian, and I have an honors degree in history, that every time a culture has gone on a complete purity cycle, it has much more often than not ended up badly. And so this is a model that exists that can work in this time frame, get people excited, get people engaged. It's not scary, it's open, it's developmental, but it's, if you go into the details of it, and I hope we do, you'll see it goes far deeper and far more meaningfully into what it means to be an American of European heritage.
I like it. I also like, by the way, the tie-in. What you're saying is that, okay, so we're going to say that there are ideas that we're going to agree on, and so on, and that these ideas that we are going to agree on are natural manifestations of the ethne. That is to say, we have a certain inbuilt predisposition mentally and emotionally, and that these are simply manifestations that we're agreeing to. Does that make sense?
Perfectly.
Yeah. So I like, and this is kind of what I mean by, but yeah, I like that tie-in.
But one other thing that's really important is, so the plan imagines, as you go into it, this idea of kindred groups based on sort of broad groupings of ethnic entities. Like there's an English group, a French group, a German group, a Slavic group, a Nordic group, sort of a trans-Mediterranean group, Italianish, and we look at these sort of things, and it's not up to me to define what that means. It's not up to you. It's up to people who embrace that identity to define it. And that's the challenge we put out there. Yeah. Stop letting others define who you are. Look at your history, use that as a guide. But this is the important transition. Instead of trying to recreate your history, use your history to discover who you are and how you can manifest positively what it means to be a German, an Englishman, a Frenchman, a Scot, an Irishman in this world. And I think if we reconnect that way, that in the sense that I've developed this sort of broader Atlantic vision of what this looks like, we can really begin building a nation that's separate from this American vision. Because what's Americanism, right? It's basically individualism, opportunity, and meritocracy. But I would argue that those values have run their course. And I would argue it goes back before the U.S. It goes back to the Enlightenment, in my opinion, and this idea of positivism, this idea that there is a directionality to history, and that through the accumulation of facts and intellectual prowess, we can somehow build the best society. Now, we certainly have more technological aptitude. There's no question of that, and there are joys that come with it, and there are costs that come with that. But I would argue that spiritually, morally, and collectively, we have never been more isolated. And so in the battle of time, I think it's time to move away from an age of intellect to an age of wisdom, where we find traditions, uphold traditions, and get ourselves back into this idea that life operates in cycles, which is what I think peoples understand. You know, every life has a cycle. You know, you're born, you go through childhood, you learn things, adulthood, family, old age, and then passing on to the next generation. But since we imagine we're building our own sort of technological Tower of Babel, we think our job is just to throw more junk on the pile. And what I'm arguing is, let's take the bulldozer, take all that mess away, the Enlightenment, let's take that away, move it aside. Americanism, let's move that aside and say, okay, we are here in this moment, in this space. What is the good? What is the society we want? What serves us? And if we have to separate ourselves, which is what it looks like we're at, how do we do that in a way where we protect ourselves and build a better future going forward? It's a divorce, it's a reset, it's a new beginning. And what's good about it is that it finally allows us to escape this cycle of responding and reacting, where you're always forced to either assume supremacy or inferiority as the other side does. And what I'm saying ultimately is that up here, and those of us who live far in the north that really do look at ourselves as a world apart, we want to start the process of separating ourselves, because we see, in the same way you're talking about fighting over history, I write books about the Civil War that's coming. They're ugly. It's frustrating. There's black pills. People call me all the time. They're like, what are we going to do? And you know what I argue? When these idiots start fighting over systems, I want to be with my brothers and walk away. Let them fight. We'll do
Yeah,
something
yeah.
different up here. You go your own damn way. You want to go fight over, who's going to be king of the rock, pal? I want to live amongst the trees.
Yeah, that's actually a point that I think about now and again. I think this is a little bit of an aside, but that's fine.
Sure.
Which is that, geez, because I live in Los Angeles, and I unironically think that this place is just going to burn at some point, and I want out before it happens. And there was a time back in like 2018 or so when I spent so much time thinking about how can I possibly, like, what can I do to fight for LA so that we don't lose it? Because all these people were saying things like, why would you just walk away? Why are you going to let them just have it? And it's like, well, this is an overwhelming battle that, to be perfectly honest, is impossible at this point to win, absent overwhelming violence that nobody wants to be a part of.
Sure.
And it's like, okay, so now that we've acknowledged this, let's because energy will be spent in some way. You're going to
Right.
spend your energy either preserving yourself and helping the future, or you are going to spend your energy fizzling out, bashing your head against a wall with absolutely nothing to show for it. I don't want the latter. I want the former. So
Sure.
whenever I hear that sentiment that you just described about just walk away and let the fight happen and don't be a part of it, I like that attitude. Overall, I mean, I still don't like the idea of leaving all the cities. I think that we're going to need some ports and whatnot. But I'm a great big fan of effectively saying, no, 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 no. If you want to waste your energy, knock yourself out, we can go and do some civilization building over here. I think that's a great idea.
It's really a powerful one. And one of the things that I found, just like, we need to understand our heritage background, what that means genetically, we're predisposed to. I think one of the things that within the larger white community that doesn't get talked about enough is, frankly, what sort of environment should we live in? We come from northern latitudes, we come from northern climates, and they teach different lessons. All right, I live in northern Maine. I'll give you an example. There's snow on my yard right now, and I'm looking out at it, and it's hard during the winter. But the fact that we have a hard winter teaches certain lessons. You need to prepare for things. If you don't prepare, you will be caught out. And you can complain to the weather that the snow is racist because it's all white, but ultimately it'll freeze anyone who doesn't learn the lessons of it. And what I find has happened in America, not just in America, I think there are parallels in European history, is that when our civilization ventures down to the comfier latitudes, that we lose something essential in what teaches us how to work well. And we do conquer and we do succeed, but the conquest that happens is we gain the land, but ultimately the people we come to gain the ideas and the benefits in the longer term. I would argue that happened in Africa. I'd argue that happened in not just North Africa, but Latin America, and to some extent the southern United States. And what I think we're going to see in this great sort of retreat is that in the same way when things get really bad in your own life, you come home, it's time for people who are in those southern climates, I would argue, and I know many disagree with me, but that's okay, should come home to places where your family and the next generation can relearn the lessons that once made us great. Because we were good, we knew how to survive. We were in environments that we were adapted over however many years to be successful in. And so when I think of the future, I mean, I think we could make the demographic argument that it's happening anyway, but I think there's a moral argument that the northern tier of the United States and Canada is where to go. Now, I personally am very aghast about cities, and one of the things that I think about a lot is that low population density is of great benefit to people. We can kind of talk through the politics of that. It's not so essential for now, but I do agree with you that whatever you imagine for your future, you are going to need ports, you are going to need commerce, you're going to need access to certain things. And one of the things that was interesting is my original configuration just had like Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and Portland, Maine. But in honesty, when I started talking to some people in movement about coming back to the New Albion concept, which I had originally thought of about 2 or 3 years ago, but people just weren't there because everyone was caught up in Trump mania and the last blast of Americanism, is that we have a big support network in Western New York and going up into Ontario and into the Maritimes because there's a lot of
Oh
people
yeah.
outside the cities who understand, and even take the state of New York. I mean, there's like 85 counties over there. 70 of them there's a lot of people who would like this. But they're trapped underneath political lines. So what we are learning to do is look past the political lines to the culture, and we find where our people live are in places of low population density, where they are choosing to live in a world apart. And so let's pretend for a moment, which I think is a reasonable supposition, that a fight might be coming politically, when as the new emergent minority of POCs comes to power, they're going to want to impose their will. Now, they were able to resist what we were doing at the national level, or I would say surrogates and proxies who don't really represent us, but nonetheless, they were able to do that by sedition at the city level. They owned city governments that had a lot of power and wouldn't enforce federal law. We, conversely, need to be ready to do that at the county level. That's sheriffs having sanctuary counties for the Second Amendment. That's towns going their own way and school boards. And what we haven't done is we've had all these entities out there working within the American context, like the Republican Party always working as a conveyor belt to put people up the line. But we haven't had truly localized parties and things. I don't care about national elections at this point. I don't really even care that much about state elections. I care about local things. I care about school boards and sheriffs and whatnot. Because if we're going to ever succeed, we have to get hyper local and get to the point where we can talk with the people in our community in the room, say, okay, you're a lefty, I get it. You like environmentalism, you like healthcare, you like education. We can have that conversation and agreement if we agree that we're one people and we're going to work together. And what I have found in my conversations up here is that there is an element of the hard left that attacks that vigorously because they are gatekeepers designed to pull their party over towards Bolshevism. But the truth is, most people who are even leftists, if you tell them you'll do a better job taking care of the economy, or excuse me, the environment, that you'll make sure the schools are good and you get health care for grandma, they actually will listen to you. And that's why this vision scares the hell out of a lot of people, because it's one that moves away from being dependent. And I say to everybody, whether you live in California or you live up here in Maine, DC isn't working for you. It's not making your life better. I mean, sure the hell isn't making life for Californians better. And I say as someone who's not a California fan, but ultimately you send a whole bunch of money there. You have these weird federal taxing rules that don't really help you. I mean, your beefs with the federal government are probably different than ours, but ultimately it's a system that doesn't serve anybody. And so I work with people in different regions who think that way. And what I am finding is, there's a lot of people in the Northwest who think that way. And we all know Dixie has its historic grievances. So, those things are kind of working. Unfortunately for you, my friend, a lot of us, when we look at the Southwest, are less than optimistic about the long-term prognosis.
I'm getting out. I'm leaving. I got to get out of here. I reasoned to myself, again, this is another aside, but I reasoned to myself that speaking of the demographic issues, once Texas goes blue, I still think it's going to be 2024. I could be wrong. The timing doesn't matter so much as the fact that it will. That's really the ultimate point. My hope is to be gone. So, yeah.
I wish you well. I will say this. I had the opportunity, and I'll make my case for the Northeast, which I always do. Is one of the advantages I think the Northeast has against, there's a couple of advantages actually. Number one is that our demographics are fundamentally better than theirs. We're in the mid 90s in terms of our white population, and our cultural homogeneity has 400 years of a collective culture. I mean, people might not like that New Englanders can be arrogant bastards who say, get out there and clean your damn lawn. But would you rather have someone who just lets the whole society go away when one person moves in and ruins the neighborhood? I mean, how has that individualistic libertarian streak worked?
Yeah.
And when I was out there in the Northwest, I observed this a lot because I was up in Idaho and I was talking to activists up there, and they are desperate to stop the Californians coming in there and changing their state. But the Republicans aren't going to do anything because they're bringing a ton of money and jobs, and that looks good. Yeah. And the land developers aren't going to do anything because the problem is you have one big city like Portland did to Oregon, Boise's doing to Idaho, where it can spread for 60 miles in any direction. And I say this as someone who grew up in Phoenix, Arizona. It was 100,000 people when I moved there in the early 1980s as an infant. By the time I left there as at the end of my high school career, it was 1 million people in Phoenix. And the same thing is happening over and over again. You come back east, it's a whole bunch of small towns. So they try to seed people and they try to do things, but it's a lot harder when every inch of your state is potted with towns between 5,000 and 10,000 people because people don't like change. There's an inherent cultural conservatism that is far deeper and I would argue far more effective at repulsing these sort of developments than you see in the Northwest. Now, I say that with all love for my Northwest brothers who have an absolutely beautiful territory, and I wish them success in developing something up there. However, I think given where the population pressures are coming from, where the money's going and whatnot, in the same way that, you're in California, you see Arizona turning blue, you see Texas turning blue, those states like Montana, Wyoming, Colorado used to be one, another one that turned, New Mexico used to be one, and Idaho, it's not going to be long before they're overrun and that the Californian diaspora, or whatever you want to call it, is going to turn all of those states. Um, no, I could be wrong about that. I hope I am. I always tell people you have a lot less time out west than we do northeast. And the other point I'd make is, and I didn't realize this until I traveled out to Portland and Spokane and Boise, is that the East is really the heart of empire. Like if you were to blow Maine off the map, people in DC would be mad because they have summer homes up here. If you were to blow Idaho off the map, I hate to say this, but there's a lot of people who would think nothing of value was lost.
Yeah.
And just true. I mean,
yeah. I know exactly
so.
what you mean. And because Tucker Carlson has a summer house in Maine, and it's like, oh, shit, man. Yeah, this is where the elites go.
Sure.
It's just the way that it is.
And that's why it didn't get so screwed up, incidentally. I mean, it's although Tucker, it's funny, I actually know where he goes, and it's a very rural, very isolated, quite poor area, but that, for people who know how to find the place, some of the best people. I mean, because Maine is basically West Virginia on the inside, Massachusetts on the outside. Kind of a weird place. So.
Yeah. 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 Okay. So I want to get back to just a couple of the points from the article. Great tangents, sure. But I just want to see if I can get back to it for a moment there.
Yeah. Let's brush through. Go for it.
Yeah, there was a section called "The Years Ahead," and it looks there's a concept that you described, and it's called Cloward Piven Plan. And I looked into that like months and months and months ago, but I forgot what that was. Now, within your article, it says, ironically, despite their overwhelming role in the destruction, the perversity of the Cloward-Piven plan ensures many people will look to communist forces rising to offer a comprehensive egalitarian solution. So with everything that you've said so far, the impression that I get is that you are very interested in going, hyper-local, basically. Side note, I know a guy in Idaho with the exact same concept, and having read, granted only part of it, but the 4th Generation Warfare Handbook, I am inclined to agree.
Sure.
Anyhow...
Bill Lind does great work.
What's that?
William Lind, who wrote that, does great work.
Yes. I've listened to a couple of his lectures, and he's great. Great big fan. If you could, just for a moment, could you give people the tiniest paragraph on the Cloward-Piven plan?
Sure. So the Cloward-Piven plan is a really simple idea. It's that ultimately that a welfare state can bankrupt a country by bringing in a whole bunch of people who use the welfare state. But that ironically, that when the welfare state bankrupts the country, it tends not to kill the welfare state, but it tends to kill the country and allow an even larger welfare state. So it's sort of a form of parasitism, but what they realized basically is that the solution to problems created by government was government. And so the Cloward-Piven plan basically says that people will not give up something the government gives them. People will fight much harder to keep something they have than they will to obtain a new thing. And so they worked pretty aggressively to push this idea that there would be more benefits. And when you look at the way entitlements are set up in the U.S. system, for instance, you can see that most of the governmental spending is totally non-discretionary, but yet we keep bringing in more and more people saying, hey, we're going to take care of them. And it used to be, even as late as the 90s, you had liberals would argue we can't bring these people in because they take away social benefits from our own people, and they take away, jobs from our poor classes, primarily minorities, to be honest. But what they've changed their mind on is they're like, okay, we're not going to try to make this system work. We're going to destroy the system because we want to go full on hardcore socialism, communism. So what they decided to do was they, at some point, accepted the idea we're going to bring in as many people as we can because when the system collapses, people are going to be coming running to the government for the answer, and we can have the system we really want, which looks something akin to what the Green New Deal is, an overwhelming totalitarian state. That's where they want to get to.
Okay. So, with regards to that, I suppose an easy question is, this is in some sense where the rubber meets the road. In some sense, how do we get around that? How do we find a way to create a barrier between us and that system?
Well, I think that when I look at it, I see the fundamental inescapable conflict is going to ultimately be the rural folk versus the city folk. The nature of their system is in order to make it work, they have to accumulate resources in centralized locations and distribute them. And when you see how they develop policy programs, I mean, look at the Obama administration for a lot of examples, but you could pick other ones too. Republicans do the same thing fundamentally, is that they tend to bring people into the cities. They tend to bring them into hive solutions, centralized solutions. So the answer sort of becomes obvious in the same way that the cities seceded against the federal government, which has already happened. I mean, whether or not they work with the federal government is totally a function of whether or not they agree with it. But if we lived in the 1860s, we'd be firing by now. However, we in the country have not done the same thing. Ironically, and this is one of the key points of the document, we in the countryside are the people most invested in America a lot of ways. We make the backbone of the military. We do all these sorts of things, and we are invested in the very system that is working against, or maybe not working against us, but they can no longer work to meet our needs and increasingly is going to be weaponized against us for the well understood cultural and demographic reasons. So what I argue is go to your county, whatever county you live in. In most places, you look at the map of the US, who voted for Trump and who voted for Hillary. It's a bad surrogate, but it's an interesting one. And that's a whole lot of red and not a lot of blue. And ultimately, you go ahead and go to those areas where it is low population density, where it has a mindset to do things differently and say, hey, we are no longer going to be bullied. And you start laying down identity about who you are and make very clear that you represent a legitimate alternative to a government that we know in our very near future is going to be a majority tyranny. And so we can then say, no, we're not going to participate. And then the shoe's on them. Now, will they attack us? Possibly, probably. But if they do, then they've picked the fight. And all we've done is what we can do in fairness to try to prevent these things. We cannot ever allow them to have a veto on us having sovereignty over our own lives and the way of life we've been promised, both within the American tradition of the Bill of Rights, as well as within our European intentions that our settlers came and braved this land not to have it given away.
Yeah, I concur. Tricky thing though, because if a demand is made on you to behave in a certain manner, and a threat is issued if you do not behave in X manner that we have demanded, we will use force and violence against you. In some sense, you're actually saying that no Fed posting or anything, obviously, but you're basically saying, yeah, there's going to be some there's going to be some messed up hair, basically, perhaps a couple of bumps and bruises.
The old saying was, he who would have war or a peace should prepare for war. With si vace pacem para bellum, right?
Yeah.
I think it was Cicero who said it, and it's absolutely true. It's one thing to come say that to Tom Kaczynski sitting up here in a cabin in Maine, but if I have 5,000 brothers standing beside me who dislike what you're going to impose, do you think a sheriff is going to come in here and try to impose that against that sort of people? I mean, we know laws don't get enforced for certain reasons, and unfortunately, the breakdown of a commonly agreed upon law is part of the imperial collapse. But ultimately, our ability to protect our way of life is to some extent an order of organization, of numbers, and logistics. And what New Albion really starts to ask is, how do we begin building a nation where we can protect ourselves against just that scenario? Because on the one hand, they probably would like to mix it up one by one by one. But if you can come up to northern Maine, and I can tell you we can put 200,000 people who will stand against you if you try to impose upon our rights, or if you try to, force and dump a whole bunch of people on us, then that becomes a different equation. And, legitimacy is a funny thing with government. Legitimacy isn't just a matter of winning elections. I mean, that ultimately, we know elections are a show and a sham in many different places. It's having the support of the people. And one of the things we haven't had is all of our people have bought into this idea that America is legitimate because we have elections. But I think we understand at this point the nature of how that process is gamed, and that we haven't put an alternative out for them for a very long time. And what I argue to people is start building your alternative at a level you can manage. If you can't think of anything else, start identifying yourself with your state. I identify myself more as a Mainer than as an American at this point. I would fight for Maine against the United States of America if it really came to it. And my point is that as we start developing these different layers of local identity, the thing you find is that they're additive. They build on each other. So if I'm Polish and Russian and German and a New Englander and an Atlantic person and a Mainer, well, I have a lot about me that really is good about who I am, that isn't caught up in this American framework. And I can walk away from that and say, hey, I'm not this anymore because this isn't me. And I think the hard part of this conversation is we have such nostalgia and memory and love for our parents. But ultimately, America is like a dad who hit the bottle too hard and is just a simpering drunk. Are we going to continue to enable him, or are we going to go out on our own? That's the question.
Yeah. That's actually been a difficult thing for me to internalize. Ever since about late 2017, I've been on this weird path of trying to figure out where I am, what I'm doing, and so on. Very difficult stuff, in all honesty. And one of the toughest things for me to face, and it really only happened earlier this year, is that basically the empire is dead. America is the America that I was told existed, which I'm finding out didn't actually exist at all. It's gone, not only in spirit but in deed. The only thing remaining now is rhetoric.
Sure.
And that's about it.
We're fighting over who gets to plunder the corpse, and the people who are in charge are the ones who care the least. They're the grave robbers, and I don't want to rob graves. Why are we black-pilled? Because all of us on all sides believe that the future is going to be worse than today. And what I suggest is the solution to that is to begin building ways that are outside of a model that we both agree is dead.
Yeah, I'm absolutely on board with that, because there are days when I will admit it's hard for me to go outside. I mean, Los Angeles is really rough. I can't actually explain that to you well enough. It's really hard to explain and articulate, but it's terrible.
Well, I got to see Portland, and my buddy who I visited there had recently moved there from LA, so I've seen quite a bit. And I mean, really, it's a regression to a third world culture. It's like living in Guadalajara. That's what it's like.
There are sections of Los Angeles that I would argue are closer to Juarez, but that's just me.
And I know how bad that is too.
Yeah.
And honestly, that's like the funny thing. People come up to my neck of the woods from there, and they're like, "Wow, you have civilization still," and we do. And this is the thing, and this is a really important point that I would tell everyone who's considering moving or even looking at their own home. Don't look at the politics. That's not what's going to tell you what's working. Look at your culture. Look if people are taking care of their front lawns. Look if they're taking care or if they've given up on their community. Because when you want to know when the demographic rot has set in and the culture's been destroyed, when you go through a community and regardless of who it is, it's all boarded up houses and nobody cares, that's a place that honestly is going to have to be cleansed. And when I say cleansed, I mean that it's going to have to go through the bottom to come back to the top. Because once you reach a certain point of decay and corruption, you live there in California, I mean, it's self-feeding on itself until it becomes like, in the same way that a body that has cancer just begins consuming itself, and where the body itself, the body politic, gets turned into this thing where it's literally creating more cancer cells from the host. That's what happens in a broken culture. And that's what happens in relativism. And that's what we see. And ultimately, all these solutions we see to it, all these different forms of lesser humanism aren't really a solution to it. You need to have faith in a set of ideas that are big enough that you're willing to walk away and stand on them, because they're going to attack you and say, why do you think you're better? And then you need to be able to say, whatever you believe, I am better because, and mean it.
I do want to go ahead and push back on one thing, which is the idea of everything reaching a bottom and then necessarily moving upward in some way. I think over the course of maybe thousands of years, that's absolutely the case, but over the course of one's own lifetime, certainly not. Possibly 2 or 3 generations even.
I'd say it's 100-year cycle, probably.
Yeah, I'm thinking about Brazil, so,
yeah,
which I think is our future.
It's I guess that's fair. I mean, I'm not going to comment on the nature of non-European civilizations and how they function, frankly, because I don't think I can really understand it properly. I mean, I've studied Asian civilization, which has a different network. I would say in Latin America, I mean, honestly, I don't know that they've had a really good vision down there about how things should work. I mean, really, since maybe Bolivar. And I say that with all respect to Pinochet and whatnot, but in a lot of ways, he was a U.S. proxy. I mean, the idea that they somehow work, and I talked to nationalists down there. I hope they find their way. I think Bolsonaro was at least an effort to begin addressing the problem. Ultimately, the problem, though, I mean, if we want to put it this way, it's a terrible word, but really the mongrelization of a people where, ultimately it's everyone against everyone is what's destroying the American Southwest. And also the big cities on the East Coast. I mean, Suffolk County, Massachusetts, that's Boston, is now majority non-white. Most people don't know that fact. There's going to be consequences to that, which I don't think Boston can escape. And mind you, that might be a very high agency thing that's bolstered by numbers of Asians who are there for schools and whatnot. But fundamentally, it's changing. You can go into Boston and find people speaking Spanish, speaking, things you'd never imagined 20 years ago. Yeah. So ultimately, you can't survive this sort of populational diaspora. It's what kills empires. And what you usually find in the death of an empire is the peripheries escape first and most intact. The Roman Empire breaks. Where did the great countries emerge? Germany, which was almost not colonized. Britain, which was very thinly colonized. And France, which was one of the first places to go away. Now, with all due respect to Italians in the Renaissance, Italy didn't get its shit together until 1860. So I think it wasn't united until 65 under Cavour. So.
Yeah, I actually see. Yeah, I don't like the word either, but the word you chose is basically the case here in California. I have noticed a huge uptick in mestizos of various proportions, 80, 20, 60, 40, 50, 50, and so on. And like it or not, they always have a propensity toward civilizational concepts that are fundamentally alien to me.
But think about it. So this goes back to my climate argument. They come from places of high productivity, high reproductivity, high resource development. So basically, they're in the jungle. There's always going to be food. And the question of who eats is who's strongest, who fights. Their life cycle in those places, and I include sub-Saharan Africa in this, and include certain places in Southeast Asia, is really rooted upon who can exercise violence the most aggressively, successfully, and maintain control that way. It is a perfectly rational and reasonable explanation of how they live in those environments. It's also antithetical to the very idea of civilization, at least in the Western construct, which ultimately relies upon self-restraint, where you give up some of your own benefit for the idea that there's a collective benefit which will then be returned to you and your kin. And like my good friend John Marks says, there's no reciprocity practiced with these people. They want all the benefits of Western civilization. They talk, imperialism and cultural appropriation. We don't talk about how we had electricity culturally appropriated, the radio, the toilet, medicine, all these things
our language.
That we gave. Our language, absolutely. We could talk all day, and if we actually added up the positives and negatives, what we would find is they would still be trying to figure out the wheel. Ultimately, and I'm not even joking. There were places in Africa this was the case. I wish I was being sarcastic. I'm really not. So ultimately, we made the mistake And this is why I go back to the Enlightenment of thinking that our ideals that worked well for our people were universal ideals because they lifted those people up. But they lifted them up to an environment they weren't ready for. So in the same way that if you gave a 3-year-old a gun, you would not be responsible in that sense that, you're responsible for what the kid does, but I'm saying it would not be a responsible act to give a child a weapon like that because they don't know how to use it. In the same sort of way, we did a disservice to the fundamental development of those civilizations through our efforts, well intentioned as they were, for an uplift. And what I would argue is that as we continue to invest our energy into these things, it's an immoral act because we are giving weapons essentially to people who are going to use them for their own self-destruction. And, in a lot of ways, you could look at sort of how communist totalitarian systems work in that same way. And you look at the cycle and the quantity of death that's practiced, although that was always going to exist to some extent. But when we separated ourselves out from it, which even in our early imperial epics we did, realistically, look at like British colonization of India in the 19th century is a perfect example. If someone even touched a white woman there, they'd burn a whole village down. They practiced a form of separatism where at least they understood there were lines and that there were things that were appropriate and not appropriate. But we're not even allowed to have those conversations. And look, that's fine. If other civilizations want to go their own way and take their chances, I'm fine with it. What I am arguing to the people listening to this, who I think overwhelmingly will understand this, is that our greatest gift is ourselves. If we take us away from them, you don't have to worry about reconquering it. They will be begging us to come back and they will destroy it and we will come back and civilization will renew. But our problem ultimately isn't the other. It's our lack of confidence and awareness of ourselves.
I actually agree with that, incidentally. There's a thing that you were talking about with the... I guess we'll just go ahead and just move down the line a little bit. There's a thing that you were talking about, the linchpins of Western civilization being, rationality, grace, and something else.
Nature.
That's right.
Right. So it's got to be reason, because you need a construct that everyone can use. You need logic. If you get to the point where you treat everything as subjective, what happens is you have an inability to share information, and man as a social animal dies. You also need something upon which you have to exercise that reason. We have to see nature as it is. And look, if that offends people, sorry, but that's nature. We've done so much harm to our civilization and our psyche by choosing tact, by choosing lies over truth, that we can no longer maintain that. And I understand there are times when it's impolitic to say things. I get that. Nonetheless, we should not lie to people. It's a bad habit. We need to break it. And the third one, which I think is important, and sometimes is a little more opaque, but so I describe it more as grace. And I'm saying this, a lot of our people are bought into this idea that we are to blame for something or that we need to exercise supremacy or superiority. Those obligations are not upon us. Every one of us makes faults. Every one of us has failings. Civilizationally, we got some things right. We got some things wrong. I'm saying that doesn't matter. Let's hit the reset button, forgive ourselves for things we've done wrong, learn from them as things in the past, and restart. And that's what grace is all about. And for people who come into this, if you were someone who was a radical leftist or the hardest core right person, if you're in the New Albion Imperative, it doesn't matter. Loyalty is one of our values. I'm going to support you because you're there fighting for the ideas. And ultimately, look, leaders get attacked. They try to decapitate movements. One day I might be dead because I talk about things that are interesting. It doesn't matter. The ideas are what need to survive. And that's what's different about this. And that's how grace connects to loyalty. That if someone is willing to be a good actor and they come in, we forgive what they did before, and then we honor them by how they act in the case. And look, if someone betrays you, that's different. You kick them out and you exile them and you don't let them back into your community. But ultimately, you give people the chance. And I think that's a powerful idea because there's a lot of people who need that. Even when we, it's not in this document, but we talk about policies. People talk about student loan debt forgiveness as one example. I'd support that. Why the hell should we have people just pay to make a bunch of rich people super richer, especially when they're the same people funding these universities that teach us horrible ideas? But people are like, oh, well, we have laws. I'm like, well, why do we follow the laws when they don't follow the laws? They don't follow them when they don't want to. Isn't that what corporations are all about? So you talk this way authentically, and some leftists might listen to you, and some people who are apolitical listen, because I'm not really interested in saying my side is right, your side is wrong. If you want to talk policy, we'll talk policy all day. And if you want to tell me a politician's a piece of crap, I'll believe you because it's true. But this is the conversation we need to have where we get past these false dualities, like left versus right, collective versus individual. These things are taking two values that both have merit in different situations and saying you have to choose one. I choose both. And I think we need to be willing to do that and understand on what basis we're doing that. So that's why I talk about these as the linchpins. They are, in my mind, the least common denominators that define at least where I live as a region. You know, I'm talking to a friend of mine out west who's out in Idaho, and he has a different thing. He imagines it more as like opportunity and merit and different things, and that fits who they are, and courage. I mean, bravery is much more important to them. They have a cowboy frontier ethic. That might be an authentic expression of who they are. I told him he needs to make a country that's half rodeo and half Rohan. I was just like, because I'm imagining what different nations look like. But that's what we need to discover in us, what those key things are. And if I'm wrong, fine, convince me something's more fundamental and more important. But that's the right conversation. What is the good? How do we become it? Because ultimately, this whole thing can be reduced to a battle of we are the forces of better fighting against the forces of more. They claim to be everything to all people. And what we have to say is that the meal you're getting at our place is better than the buffet line they promise you. That's the fight.
I like that. I like that a lot. Side note, here in Los Angeles, I happen to know a lot of people that are amazed at the incredible range of restaurants, 95% of which are mediocre and not worth walking into. And like I can count on one hand the number of restaurants that I actually like, formally like, here in Los Angeles. So it's like, weirdly, yeah, I'm actually seeing that. I'm seeing this more is more ethos in effect here in Los Angeles. And yeah, I would much prefer, yeah, just, and this is why I don't go out, because I don't care to, because it doesn't interest me in the
We
least.
got one diner in town where I live, Greenville, Maine, population 1,600. You go to Annie M's, you get yourself a good breakfast. It's not a big menu, it's not a fancy menu, but the waitress meets you with a smile. She knows your name. People talk to one another. It's good enough. And that's one of the things, that if you want more, and it's an interesting thing. I'm glad you brought it up because so many people think of ethnicity, especially white people. It's really paternalistic in terms of people making me tasty food. And there's a lot of white liberals who go out there and they reach minorities and they look at them paternalistically. They look at them like Pokemon. They collect them. They get a Guatemalan gardener, a Honduras nanny, the little Thai lady who does, or usually the Vietnamese who does the nails and all those things. And they look at them like an underclass in the same way that Romans looked at slaves. And it's paternalistic BS because they send their kids to private schools. They separate, and they go back to Cape Cod or Hyannisport. And so what I found, and this is one of the really interesting things about the New Albion Imperative, is we've talked to some non-whites about this, and they're as excited as anyone because they're like, geez, it's about time you guys got your friggin' act together.
I love
how
it.
long were you going to let everyone run you out of here,
Yeah, actually,
So,
I was talking with a guy. I think I can't remember, like Iranian or something like that.
sure.
Pretty Americanized. But anyway, I think he's like second generation. But
Sure.
he said that exact same thing. He was like, dude, I don't understand why white people are allowing their entire civilization to burn in front of them. And he was like, dude, this can't be allowed to happen. And I was like, oh, thank God. Of all the things, here in Los Angeles, the people that are on our side are the not white people. It's really weird.
But it's not uncommon because in a lot of ways they are more aware of ethnocentrism, and this is one of the interesting contradictions. I live in the whitest state in America, and people here are the least aware because they believe their rhetoric because they haven't had experience to debunk it. And there's a life cycle. I think we might have talked about this at a previous show, but it bears a quick repeating, which is that the politics of a place, of a white area, goes from Democrat to Republican to Democrat based upon where the demography is. So like when it's over 90, it seems like it's sort of a liberal Sweden type place, and then eventually it ends up sort of where like Wisconsin and Minnesota are, where they're trending rightward because their demography is shifting in a bad way, and the white population's aware of it. It can get locked in place like some places in the deep south have, or it can accelerate out of control very fast like California has. But this is what happens in identity politics. Now, what you will find is that if you are willing to talk to groups, and let's be very clear, we look at identity politics, and I used the term earlier, POC. People do not think of themselves as POC, and we've had a lot of really productive and interesting conversations with native tribes up here as just one example of this. And I will say, up here in Maine, we recently elected a progressive governor because people thought it'd be nice to elect the first woman, whose money 75% came out of state. In fact, a lot of it came from California, so you can imagine what the policies look like. But one of her first acts, despite what she said she was going to do, was to rename Columbus Day Indigenous Peoples Day. And all the white liberals went out and they were very excited and they clapped and thought they were so progressive. And they were surprised to find a lot of the Indians didn't like it because A, they didn't like having their day reappropriated, which was basically a white man holiday, and that they were all lumped together as, hi, we red people. So it's one of those things where if you treat people with respect and dignity and try to understand, and this is the way of true nationalism on an ethnic basis. I talked to Abenaki, to Penobscot, to Seneca, to Iroquois, different Algonquin tribes. And a lot of them are ultimately on board for something that says, hey, respect our integrity, respect our sovereignty. We want to be part of it too. And that's one of the really weird things about this New Albion project I've learned is that when you respect the cultural identity of tribes, whether they be white or non-white, in a lot of ways, there is an opportunity for everyone to benefit, to develop through separatism, and to go ahead and choose how permeable that group wants to be. If a group wants to live in isolation, so be it. That's their right. And one of the big mistakes we've made for a very long time is compelling people who don't want to live with a certain group of people to have to live with them. I think most people want to be a little bit open, but be able to enforce their borders. You have a house, you open your door at certain times, you shut your door, lock it, and put up fences at others. That's reasonable civilization.
I also want to go ahead and just throw it out there that I have been a staunch supporter of unhyphenated nationalism as the descriptor that I use for myself for that very reason, because it occurred to me that reciprocation, if we are to... The problem at the moment is that all non-white groups in America and in Europe are allowed to advocate for their group, and we're the only ones that are not allowed. But the moment we open it up to everyone so that all people may advocate for their own group, then suddenly, yeah, exactly that, then reciprocation, mutual respect, respecting of people's boundaries, all of that becomes very meaningful. So I completely agree with that. And I like that way of framing it because I've even I've talked to a couple of progressives about this stuff, and they when you talk about nationalism from the standpoint of respecting people's autonomy as groups, that's what the left, in terms of their rhetoric, the internationalist
That's fine.
left.
We can use left and right as placeholders. I understand the problems, but
Yeah. Okay. Good. Thank you. But yeah, that's what the DNC. We'll just say that we'll say the DNC for now, even though that's also not a good descriptor. Progressives, I guess. Fuck it. It's fine. They, in terms of rhetoric, they purport to be for the people having autonomy, from group to group to group. And yet they always seem to do exactly that, lump all groups together. And I have found that when I just come right out and say, no, I want Mexicans to be Mexicans. I want, all these people to be what they are and to be autonomous and to govern themselves. And I want the exact same for white people. When you phrase it in those terms, I've seen a weird mental lock click where they're like, I can't process this because the indoctrination program is causing me to want to reject this because you're white. I've seen that. I've actually watched that. But I'm starting to think that if there was... this is like going into like George Lincoln Rockwell territory, I guess, but
It's fine.
if there was a way to actually open up the dialogue to non-whites and to have a real exchange, consider George Lincoln Rockwell he would talk to the Black Panthers. He would talk to all those guys, and they're like, yeah, we actually...
He made a $20 contribution to Louis Farrakhan, who gladly, or not Malcolm X, who gladly took it.
Yeah.
I've seen the video.
Yeah, it's like, well, I mean, and that would actually...
But you kind of hinted at it. The problem fundamentally is in our relationship with minorities.
Yeah.
There's a couple grifters out there who get a lot of attention, but most minorities are not the problem. The problem is our own white liberals. And of course the other issue, which George Lincoln Rockwell was well familiar, which is a different and more complicated issue that gets into that history stuff. But ultimately, reciprocity is a good way to solve those sorts of issues. And what I would argue is that one of the genius things about the New Albion Imperative is that we can short circuit some of those things because we're arguing for ethnic visions. We're arguing for a Celtic vision, a Scottish vision, an Irish vision, an English vision. And we're arguing for these as cultural traits, right? I mean, one of the things I took a lot of inspiration from in developing this was how the people of Quebec defend their culture. I've studied enough French to be able to read their papers up there, and I go up there somewhat frequently. And really, they don't give a damn about someone telling them they can't live their culture. And they've spent 300 years fighting Canada, taking advantage of every opportunity to defend their own, which shows that it can be done in a Western society with a Western group against a lot of different attacks if one is willing to separate and have enough cultural confidence. And it's not a political thing, it's a cultural thing. And so this project says that we want to keep the sort of Western tradition of having, the ability to make choices and meaningful things, but make it hyper local. And, we could talk and take a whole nother show, but I could talk about my sort of idealized vision of government. But in a super, super short version, the only thing I have people voting for is mayors, because I believe hard power like law enforcement and economics should be as local as possible so that money stays in your community and you determine it. But ultimately that you need at the high national level, whatever your nation's going to be, you need soft power. And that's where we really failed. We didn't lose this war politically. We lost this war culturally because we weren't in control of our education system. We gave it away. We weren't in control of what it meant to be an American. We didn't articulate that. We didn't try to assimilate that. We let high culture get destroyed by pop culture. And to go back to that argument, why does your white friend not want to defend white culture? Because on some level, they know the culture we put out there is complete trash, and that their self-hatred is a function of the shame that they feel for what we've allowed our culture to descend to.
There's something, and I guess I'm jumping around a little bit. There's something that you had mentioned near the end of the other one, not the Operation Brushfire, but the Esoteric.
Did you like that one? That one's a little wild, huh?
Yeah, that one's. I still have to digest that one, and I think that would be worth its own stream. But which, by the way, was I don't know if you saw the title of this stream, but I entitled it "Planting Pine Trees for the Future" as a reference to that.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, for sure. There was a little bit in there that was talking about projecting culture. And I was thinking about this. I don't remember what the hell I was watching. No, I wasn't. I was reading a newspaper, an actual communist newspaper, that was talking about how one of their radio stations, I think in New York, ended up going under for one reason or another, financial, but I don't remember the details. And sure. They were talking about how this is a travesty, this is awful, because we need this radio station so that we can, defend our people and our culture and project our values and blah, 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 or something like that. And I couldn't help but think we need that. We need media. We need woke media for us. We need our guys and we kind of have that a little bit with all of these little micro streams that populate YouTube and increasingly DLive.
Sure. Yeah, we need friendly platforms too. I
Yeah.
mean, this goes back to network building. I was a town planner before I was an activist, and one of the things you look at is how you build critical infrastructure. And you want to make sure you have control over your infrastructure, because how many people have we seen, they develop a big audience, they get brand identity, they put all this money and effort into it. And firstly, I mean, obviously the monetization, that's like a complete travesty if you're just going to be a fair set of rules. But beyond that, just the complete deplatforming. I mean, I say this as someone who's been banned from PayPal and who's been blocked from certain platforms, and I'm actually a pretty calm guy. I'm not very radical, which is perhaps why I get blocked. But we have content creators, and I think that we have yet to understand the economy of the information age in a way that's really useful. That ultimately, information is power, and social capital that exists for influencers is our ability to put ideas out there and build networks to act upon them. The problem is we put all of our ideas and our hearts into these networks, and then we put our money elsewhere. And what we need to begin doing is
Yeah.
figuring out a way to intelligently put money into networks that benefit us. And I'll give you a very simple example of this. It's deliberately apolitical, which was New England has a lot more successful small towns than any other place in America, for the most part, per capita, because it withstood Walmart. It chose to go local. It chose to pay a
Oh,
higher cost. It chose a lot of different reasons that it was trying to keep towns safe, keep business owners protected. Some were good, some were selfish. It doesn't really matter. But what they ultimately chose was to fight the problem of bigness. They chose better versus more, and we pay a premium for it. The cost of living, as far as that goes, is higher. Nonetheless, there is a benefit to being able to go get things in town. And the hardware company that sponsors the girls' soccer team, that's still there because they're in town and they can afford to be there because they have jobs here.
yeah.
So there's all these sort of things about virtuous cycling that's really important. And I give the left some credit, especially like our friends over in Vermont. They really do understand there are good ways in which communal thinking can work. And I actually think at the local level, a leftist sort of way of looking at problems is entirely appropriate. I just don't think it scales up. And I think, unfortunately, they've bought into this cultural insanity that all people can be replaced with other people.
Yeah.
So we all have to learn from each other. We have to have those conversations. But I mentioned that in response to what you were talking about, because I think that once we begin taking our content creators, being intelligent about finding ways to make those ideas popular and investing into our own communities, and I understand that has to start small, but you can do it and you can make it work. And I will tell you, as someone who does it, when I was town manager, I did a certain amount of income, and now that I've become an author or producer, I do audiobooks, I do print books, I do, at least so far, I've done better with this lifestyle than my old one. And, people say, oh, you're not supposed to make money. I mean, why the hell not? You need to survive, and we need to be able to support our guys and our women and those sort of things. I mean, we can't be thinking that, we're rushing in there for the last cause. This isn't a hopeless cause where all that's left are suicide pacts. This is a chance to take back our civilization. It's a little bit of a slog. We're going to have to work quickly, but the inherent defeatism of thinking that we aren't building for a future is what we need to destroy. And it starts when we eliminate the hyphenated nationalism. But what I would say to you is the biggest hyphen we're all stuck with is saying we're a European American or whatever. It's time to fuse what we loved about our past and our distant past into new visions. My Atlantic vision is one of those. I hope others precipitate.
I think that there is a lot of room for it. You were talking about how, and I don't know, I just realized that you're at about 1 hour and 15 minutes. I don't know how much time you've allocated, so.
I can go another 15 minutes. We can do that. Is
Okay,
that good
cool.
for you?
Completely fine, totally fine.
Okay.
I think that there's a lot of growth potential, and what I mean by that is there is so much discontent within within those who are aware. There's much discontent, but I would swear, maybe this is in my head, I'm not 100% on this, because it's really hard to talk about these things openly here in Los Angeles. I would swear that there are a lot of people that basically have like conversations just by reflex action, and that there's an emptiness behind it. And where there is emptiness, there is a desire for something to move in. And I mean, I live in Los Angeles. I was talking to another guy. believe he was mestizo, but whatever. Anyway, and the guy, like, he was. I mentioned a couple of things, and he said of his own volition, America's dead or America's dying or something. Like, everyone freaking knows. Absolutely everyone knows. So I think that, like, they're trying to suppress a natural impulse, and I really think that absent their suppression game, I think that the nationalist movement would just have, like, an immediate uptick, like, and move directly into like, larger spheres. So I think this is the right tack. The trick at the moment is finding ways, in my opinion, I can be wrong. I think the trick is finding ways to talk about this openly and in ways that gets people, quote, on our side. And I guess these are all tangents. We've done nothing but tangents.
No. Well, life is a tangent, you know.
Yeah,
ultimately, it's the short line between it from here to death.
Yeah.
You know, the rest of it's just us chasing along the river and going along the shore. But that's where you see the interesting things.
Yeah.
And what I would say, what jumped at me from what you said, just to respond to it before I lose my train of thought, is that ultimately, you know, you're right that there are a lot of gatekeepers holding back the vision of nationalism. We can see hints and pieces of how it's coming out. But I think fundamentally the big gain is yet to be realized, because two things are really going to push this. Number one will be the loss of Texas, which, like you say, will happen within the next decade. You know, what year, we don't actually know. The other thing that will ultimately happen is that people at some point will realize the Republicans can't win. So that's not an answer, and that they will move to a situation beyond voting. We are peeking over the horizon of a very dark time, thinking what a more beautiful future will look like. And so what we can do is begin laying seeds so that those, when that time comes, will have already been planted for people to come to. And I think in terms of how you have that conversation with people is that you have an honest conversation. You don't have to be crude. You don't have to be rude. You just say, if someone that states something that's false, you tell them, well, I just don't agree with you. And people are usually shocked. They're like, well, I guess I never really thought about just what everyone thinks, right? I'm like, yeah, maybe everyone thinks it, but it's wrong. And you know, what I always challenge people to do is be humane, be polite, but be honest. And if you are willing to be honest with yourself and not defend the sort of polite lies upon which this fiction is based, what you realize is what your mestizo friend realized, is that America's dead. And the sooner you realize she's dead, we can grieve for her, we can get past her, we can build something new. And whether we do it together, which I think is unlikely, or we part. Maybe we part into 4 different pieces. Let every group have a chunk. I don't know. Maybe we do it in smaller ones. But if we can have a mature conversation about it now, we have a much better chance of seeing positive outcomes than if we wait until things get really bad, or when one side's about to take over, which is what I think we probably will do, unfortunately. But yeah, we're really ahead of the curve a little bit on this conversation, but it's inevitable that we're in the place where people are going to get to.
Someone once said to me a couple months ago that our little clique, our little group, and by our little clique, I am including you and many of the people in the chat, we are approximately 6 months ahead of basically everybody right now. Like, I've heard talking points that I've discussed with other people, like said by third-party people months after the fact. I think there's something to that. Anyway,
it's absolutely true. I mean, and I feel like, and I'm not tooting my own horn, I feel like I've been even slightly further ahead because I've been writing about some of the stuff for a while. But I mean, ultimately, it doesn't do you any good unless you can bring people along. So we who are here have to take a step back, explain to people in terms they can understand how they get to where we are, and ultimately present something hopeful. Because I think the other really important point that people don't talk about nearly enough, but I think is really important, is you need to have something hopeful if you want people to join you. I mean, telling everyone that you're going to join the Gravediggers division to go ahead and put Western civilization in the dust, that's how you end up with people saying that, well, the hell with it, I'm just going to go spend my money and enjoy it while things are good. And we don't need that. We need people to realize that, in fact, the degradation of our civilization presents a once in maybe a quarter millennium opportunity to redefine who we are in a way that's much better. Everything is going to have to get tossed out, and I'm excited for the chance to create something new. In the same way that Rome's collapse led to the great nations of Europe, America's collapse will lead to the great nations, the rebirth of the Western Empire. And when I say empire, it's not going to be one empire, it's going to be different nations. But I am so excited for my Atlantic home and the things we can do. And I'm excited to see what other people will do when we're not all fighting over who's going to control one another, but let each other go our separate paths in ways that are healthy and meaningful to our people.
Yeah. Yeah. Side note to that, actually, no, it doesn't matter. I had like three thoughts crash into my head all at the same time. There was one thing that I wanted to say, one tangent back, which is that I think, speaking of talking about these things out in public, openly, honestly, and truthfully, and doing so in such a way that it opens up for discussion for new people who have never heard any of these ideas, I'm really excited about the Groyper Rush. You've heard about that, right?
Absolutely. I think it's doing a wonderful job of getting ideas out there that, I mean, the funny thing about the collapse of the alt-right is the ideas never went away. They just melded back into the Republican base. And, ultimately truth is invasive, man. And the questions they're asking about the consequences of demography, the amorality of modern conservatism are spot on, because if you don't stand for anything and you let everyone replace you, then what are you fighting for? Just your paycheck, I guess. And these people are acting like mercenaries and revealing themselves. I think the danger, though, and this is really what I spend a lot of time worried about, is when the people who are doing this, and God bless the Groypers, are doing great work, when they don't get the results they want, because ultimately I suspect the capital that bankrolls the congressional campaigns and the presidential campaign is going to get what they want, where they will more gladly lose than give power over. The question is, where do they go from there? And the answer can't be into defeatism or something that's not useful. I think about that every day in the project I work on. So when November comes and the disappointment follows, that we understand that getting past the political process is what they are actually accomplishing. I mean, I think some of them are thinking maybe they'll reform it, maybe they're not. I don't know. Ultimately, we need to get in a position where we think past that because of the reasons that we understand structurally and whatnot. And my next book will go into it in exhaustive detail. I basically spent the first 10 chapters giving people a black pill suppository so that they'll stop believing that America can be saved, because I don't want you to hurt yourself. Yeah. I don't want you to believe in a delusion. If you can read those first 10 chapters I write in my next book and argue America can still be saved, I want some of what you're smoking.
Yeah.
But ultimately, I don't think that's reasonable. And then so I make the argument, well, why it happens? Because ultimately we're facing two forces. We're facing, a crazy left that's been allowed to run roughshod over the culture. But ultimately, more importantly, we're facing elites at a global level who are letting this happen, they're encouraging it to happen. And that's the more interesting part of the story that I think people need to be thinking about, and I mean, it's a little alt-light of me, but honestly, America's been set up for destruction for a lot of different reasons. Some of it has to do with ideas they don't like. Some of it has to do with fear of our demography and things that we do like that they don't like. But let's figure out what it is that makes us most potent and build upon that. The Groypers, in asking the questions that they're asking and making others to reveal themselves, are doing a lot of work in bringing us down that line. And one of the interesting things you mentioned earlier, that we were like 6 months ahead. What we keep seeing over and over again, and it's an amazing and quite frankly unsettling thing, is how short political time is getting. Like, these movements are moving so fast on the internet that what's true at one moment, 3 months from now, may not even seem relevant. And that is very hard to keep up with as commentators and organizers.
This, I think, is why I like your concept of civilization building so much, because there seems to be some kind of permanence to it. Because there's so much fluff to cycle through. It's like, well, all right, great, but now we've got like all these new like memes and trends to worry about that ultimately are going to fall away anyway. So like you end up in this weird like permanent immediacy, like nowness, with no ability to have a long-term plan, and that sucks.
This is why I say that what people need to do and what I recommend to anyone and everyone is go ahead, fight the battles, have fun trolling, but start building foundations for things that will last into the future. And if you build something in truth, you'll never have to run from it. And that's why I think, to use the phrase you used, I like it. It's civilization building. I had a friend earlier today refer to what we did as creating Generation Zero. We are the reset. We are not
Yeah.
defined by anyone else. We define ourselves, and we are the new normal. That's what we need to have.
I like that concept. I like that. There was a thing that I remember thinking to myself about a year and a half ago, which was that Generation Z is probably going to end up giving birth to Generation Omega. And if we can just lay the groundwork for Generation Omega, or perhaps Generation Alpha, I'm not sure which would be the one to use, but if we can just lay the groundwork for them, I think we will
That's what we need to do. And we're not,
succeeded.
and I will tell you, we're not far from it for the reason you described. People already know that the emperor has no clothes. We just have to go out there and say, hey, why is he skinny dipping and we're not?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I guess I kind of want to, because I don't want to take too much more of your day, and I want to thank you very much for all of this, and I'd like to chit-chat some more about, because I kind of feel like there were, it's not that I kind of feel like, I absolutely feel like there are a lot of things, like there's one little comment that I had. I did write one thing down, which was, you were talking about responsibilities and rights within New Albion, and one of the responsibilities was number 8, discover truth through the use of reason. And it occurred to me that that hints at correspondence theory, truth theory, as opposed to pragmatic truth theory or consensus truth theory. And I really there's a much deeper conversation that would be kind of fun to have about that.
Yeah, we can go into it, although I will
Yeah.
tell you, I think I would probably disappoint you.
Yeah.
And I only say it in this sense because believe it or not, I'm not really the best theoretician. A lot of people go through my works and try to apply theory to it, but in honesty, I'm sort of an intuitive philosopher.
Yeah.
I realize things are true through observation and experience. I often joke that I take a lot of trips and I hang out at thrift stores, dive bars, and diners because I look at people as they are. I listen to them. I have genuine interactions, not with the people at the top, but people who are really living in the world.
Yeah.
And so I kind of collect the evidence, if you will, and develop an understanding. And then I just ruthlessly test theories until I find what works through trial and error. And so people can usually build better abstracts around the concepts that I put out there than I do. But usually the intuition of it is pretty solid. And to be fair, my frameworks aren't bad. I mean, it's not like I'm lazy intellectually. It's just that fundamentally, I sort of believe life is inherently paradoxical. But I do, in as much as I understand what you say, yeah, I do tend to think that there isn't especially say that truth is a subjective collaboration. I mean, I'm an objective thinker. I'm a Christian. I believe in absolute truth. And it has meaning to me. And I always think it's the secret to what I work on. That I believe that the universe is a function of faith rather than just being. But I think that as you start to realize the paradoxes up there, you start to realize these questions. But who knows? You live up here in the North Country, up in the Rose Woods, and you start having all sorts of crazy ideas. So it's certainly something we can discuss more in the future.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there'll be much more in this project to cover. And since I can't see the chat, I'm just say if there are people there, I want to say thank you for listening as well. I always appreciate it and appreciate all you guys. And if there are any questions, newalbion@protonmail.com. And you're going to see us come out with a more public push for this in January. But especially if you're up here in the Northeast anywhere, I mean, originally this project was just in New England, but we are reaching into Canada. We're reaching into the Great Lakes. I mean, really the historic U.S., if you think of the U.S. sort of minus the West Coast states, about circa 1860, the places that weren't part of Dixie is kind of where we have sway, and over into Canada. And that's where we think naturally we can reach people. So if you like any of it, send something along. If you have ideas, we're always looking to bring people in. It's collaborative. I mean, within the sort of core concepts we put out there, and we like to do that. And thank you for having me on as well. I really appreciate the opportunity to share some ideas and have a great conversation.
Yeah, for sure. And would you mind hanging out for just a brief moment after stream? I'm going to go ahead and close out the stream now, but
Yeah,
I just wanted
sure.
to ask you a
give
couple
you
of
a minute.
questions off stream.
Yes.
Cool. Thank you.
One other thing,
Yeah.
Twitter at Tom Kaczynski, probably the other good place to find me. Follow me. I say all sorts of things that are annoying to people you don't like.
I think we're okay with that. I think we're all okay with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for popping by. At some point, with your approval, I would like to read out some of your pamphlet on Operation.
You have my absolute blessing to share anything within
Okay.
the Brushfire text.
Okay, good, because I actually liked it a lot. I'd made mention.
We might have a 2.0 version of it coming out because there's a couple small editing errors.
Please do.
I put that together in like an hour and a half. It's crazy, but
for an hour and a half
go work it.
Typing job, it's great. It's really good.
Thank you.
There are like minor technical issues with like clarity in certain sentences, but I realized as I was reading it that you were basically typing it out as you would be speaking. So that's different from how you read, but that's like a me issue. That's not a you issue, if that makes any sense. But I mean, outside of that minor critique, like no, these are great concepts. I like
people don't realize my books are edited by people who are far more talented at correcting things. It's a funny thing, when you write your books. Like at this point, I'm on my 8th book, and I'm thinking, oh, I'm so good at this now. And my editor sends it back with 2,162 things to correct.
Yeah.
I'm like, holy hell! Why am I so challenged?
Who cares? It's fine. You know what?
You get used to it. It's just like it's humbling, and a little humility is not always a bad thing. So
yeah. Anyway, okay. So I'm gonna close out stream.
Yes, sir.
I want to thank Tom, obviously, for popping by for what has been a fantastic chat. Thank you very much. Thank you for all of your hard work on the pamphlet. I'll probably be reading it on my stream in the next couple of days. So
feel free to correct any grammatical errors you find along the way.
Okay. And thank you to the chat. Thanks for everybody for popping by. Incidentally, Tom, great big positive reactions. So thank you, chat. Thank you, Tom. And I guess that about does it. I'm just going to go ahead and close out to the intro track, or the outro track that I normally play. So there we are. All right, guys. Thank you, everybody. And remember to floss and also read Galatians and get woke.